Welcome to the Surrogates Corner with James Mahan.
Welcome to Surrogates Corner with James Mahan. James passionately advocates for surrogates and egg donors, providing legal support to every stage of the journey. I'm Lisa Mosby, and today we're talking about how surrogates can legally prepare for high-risk pregnancies and medical complications before they happen. From choosing your doctor to negotiating hard clauses, we'll walk you through the legal protections you should have in place for peace of mind throughout your journey. James, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Lisa. It's a pleasure to be here.
James, when you're reviewing a surrogacy contract, what are some of the key provisions that you look for to protect a surrogate in case of a medical complication or a high-risk pregnancy?
The biggest thing with a complication or high-risk pregnancy is, one, how do we find it? So that can get into what testing is needed to happen, maybe things that we know about for certain IPs. They know that embryo quality issue may be a concern for them. So that's always good for the surrogate to know ahead of time. The biggest implication of that complication is that you're going to have a lot more appointments. So you're going to see a specialist, you might have to go to MFM. Some of that will look at who chooses who those providers are. The big one is just that when you have that many more appointments, a lot of things related to your benefit package and who covers things like mileage to and from your appointments or childcare for your appointments or lost wages for them can run into aggregate maxes if we have those. That's one thing to kind of look at, is to see, one, if those do occur, what does your benefit package say and how might that impact what is really needed for you as an individual surrogate if it does come into play.
And then, James, are surrogates typically able to choose their OB or hospital? Or can the intended parents push for specific providers? And how should that be negotiated up front?
Normally, you're not going to have IPs who are pushing for a particular doctor. Part of the reason for that is that a lot of times the IPs and the surrogate are not anywhere local to each other or anywhere near each other. So usually the parents don't really know the hospital systems or the specific providers. A lot of times we're going to look for is, can the surrogate use the same OB who maybe delivered her children or the same hospital that she delivered at? Usually it's going to say the surrogate can pick her doctor and her OB and her hospital as long as they're in network for whatever insurance policy she has, and they're able to handle the pregnancy or any kind of complications or issues that come up. So normally on a smooth pregnancy, if a surrogate wants to use her OB, as long as that person is still in network for her with whatever plan we're using for her, usually not a big deal. If the hospital she wants to go to, that maybe she delivered her kids at, can handle what's going on with the pregnancy, normally not a problem. Where it will say something in the contract where you can see that change is if there's like a NICU level required. If there's a certain level 3 or level 4 requirement because of what's going on with the pregnancy, we may have to go to a different hospital because the one that's closest to the surrogate may not be that high of a level NICU, depending on where she is and what's going on with the pregnancy.
And then, if bed rest or extended monitoring or hospitalization become necessary, what contract language should already be in place to ensure that proper support and compensation are already in there?
Yeah, so the upper portions of the contract where it normally talks about like the legal obligations and what people are going to do and whose responsibilities, fall with whom, will typically say that if the OB or if the medical provider thinks that they need bed rest or need hospital bed rest, something like that, the surrogate's willing to comply with whatever the medical recommendation is for her. Where that will butt up against other problems for her is like, well, if you're in the hospital on bed rest, who's at home helping with the kids, or who's at home helping with housekeeping or lost wages if you can't do your job? And that's where, again, a normal benefit package from an agency or from an independent journey is not typically looking at worst case scenarios or what happens if a surrogate gets put on, bed rest at week 12 for gestational diabetes. They're just not really meant to account for that. And what you really want to be on the lookout for is, does your package have any kind of maximums in place for you? Sometimes it will say things like a bed rest provision will only last for 8 to 12 weeks during a pregnancy, or a max of 8 or 12 weeks after the pregnancy. Some will say certain things like you can only use this provision up to a maximum of $5,000 total. Again, on a smooth pregnancy, that may not be a big deal because you probably won't reach that. But if you have one of those complications in your pregnancy and you have one of those provisions in your package saying that you are capped at a certain amount, especially if you're, a mother with multiple young children, or childcare is going to be expensive for you and wherever your cost of living situation is, those provisions may become very restrictive for you if you do find yourself in a complicated pregnancy.
And then what is the difference between a routine pregnancy clause and a complication clause, and why does the distinction matter?
So the routine, there's when it talks about complicated pregnancies or whatever, usually it's gonna be all wrapped up into like your medical recommendation section of your contract. So it's gonna say if there are certain tests or procedures or things that are recommended to you by your doctor, you're willing to do it. If the intended parents want to do something, usually if your doctor doesn't object to it or think it's a bad idea for you, you're kind of saying you're willing to do those as well. When it becomes a complication, usually means either your OB can't handle it, they need to go send you to go see like a specialist or an MFM, or there's something going on with the pregnancy where we start talking about like specific specialists for whatever the condition that might be with the child. If that happens, you're kind of up in the air because that's where the parents may say, wherever you are, surrogate, the best doctor to look at this is in Seattle, and I want you going to go to Seattle to go visit with them. They would pay for her to go, they would pay for the travel and everything else to get her there, but sometimes that can happen if you have one of those really rare circumstances of an ultra complicated pregnancy. If it's just we have a twin pregnancy or we wind up with something else that's just, potentially more complicated than a general smooth, singleton pregnancy, that's where the biggest thing is usually going to be how many appointments do you have to have? How often are you going? Because then your normal, like every 4 weeks and then every 2 weeks, every 1 week appointments start doubling because you're a twin pregnancy and you might be more complicated. And now you have a lot more appointments you're going to. You're missing a lot more work. You're taking a lot more time away from your family, your kids to do those. And that can be an issue for your benefit package and whether or not it's built to kind of deal with those well or not.
And James, you did elaborate a little bit on intended parents being able to request extra testing, send a surrogate somewhere, maybe extra monitoring, or things that start to get complicated. How much control does the surrogate have over those situations and the decisions at that point?
So, I mean, one is the primary care physician or primary treating physician for the surrogate once she's pregnant is going to be her personal OB. Again, sometimes they know that OB from their prior pregnancies, they have a working relationship with them. Sometimes the surrogate has to just pick an OB from a list because they've moved or their last pregnancy was 4 or 5 years ago and they're a different location, and they may not have like a good rapport with that particular physician. But that physician is still kind of in charge of her health and her well-being, and they are meant to look out for what's best for them. So they can kind of push back if the parents are asking for things that their doctor just doesn't see any medical basis for requesting. Then there's almost always going to be a second opinion clause for either party that says, if you don't like kind of what we think we're going to do, you can ask for a second opinion about what's going on. Most of the surrogates are not going to use that unless the parents are requesting something. Usually if their doctor says, hey, this is what I'm seeing, I think you should go see this or do this procedure or whatever, most of the time they're going to say, okay, my doctor thinks this is what I need, I'm willing to do it. If the parents just want something or going to see a specialist or feel like you need a different test or whatever, that's where sometimes we'll say, hey, if my doctor disagrees, then we can go pick like a neutral third party doctor to evaluate this, and then we'll go off of what that person says. So that's meant to be kind of your last ditch effort, kind of a neutral party to figure out, does this make sense? Is this someone who's like not really involved with the surrogacy arrangement? If they just look at it medically, does that seem like a reasonable request for the surrogate or not? We don't usually see it getting there because most of the time it's going to be either a reasonable request or the surrogate just says, okay, I can understand why they want that and I'm willing to do it. But that's where we have the option to go to if there's just a real kind of disagreement or a non-meeting of the minds as to what that should look like.
About negotiating a second opinion clause, especially in high stakes medical decisions?
So I mean, what I normally look for if it's in there is to say who kind of who gets the ultimate decision authority if we get there. So sometimes it will say things like, surrogate, you have your doctor, and if they disagree, we'll go see somebody else. And if there's a disagreement about one or two options, we'll pick the IP's attorney or the IP's doctors to what they think, right? So the default is, surrogate, if you don't like this, great. But if I find a doctor that kind of supersedes or disagrees with your doctor, we're going to pick that person's, desire anyway. What I'd usually like to see is it say, if the two doctors disagree, then we bring in the third doctor to say, hey, Dr. 1 says this, Dr. 2 says that, what does this third doctor think? And they get to referee. And then you're kind of stuck with, if you lose 2-1, that's just unfortunately the way it goes. But that's usually what I like to see. And a lot of attorneys have that in there as their kind of, templated portion of that contract is to say, disagreements can be referred out. And if there's there is a strong disagreement, then we bring in somebody else to kind of look at it and decide.
James, are there specific triggers that allow for early termination of the agreement, either by the surrogate or the IPs, if a medical risk increases?
So there's two different issues that come into play. One is can we terminate the contract, or two, do we have to look at terminating the pregnancy? So if there's a medical complication with the pregnancy, such that the surrogate's health or well-being in her physician's estimation is threatened or at risk, then the decision about whether to continue the pregnancy pretty much stays with her. She does agree not to terminate an otherwise healthy pregnancy for a non-medical risk to her, but if there is a problem there, then that could happen. On the flip side, it usually would say if there's a problem with the child or the fetus and the parents are asking the surrogate to terminate the pregnancy, then she's willing to do that. That can vary a little bit on where the surrogate is, state by state, what the timing of it looks like, what the conditions might be needed to be met in order to make that happen. But that's usually where we would kind of look at that for a very complicated pregnancy. And then if that were to occur, the presumption is that the contract itself would terminate automatically once that happens. But there have been cases where there is a complication, something doesn't go well, the pregnancy is ended, and then the parents and that surrogate decide to try again with a second cycle, which if everybody is agreeable to it and is willing to do it, then that's totally fine. It's just not something we normally see, because it kind of creates an emotional event for everybody that sort of takes some time to kind of get through.
Yeah, I can understand that. And then financially, what should surrogates make sure is covered in advance, from lost wages, childcare, medical, and travel? You've mentioned several of them. If there are complications that arise, how do we protect for that?
Yeah. So the biggest thing on the surrogate side, and this is the hardest part usually, is because, again, when they're joining these groups, when they're becoming a surrogate and signing up with an agency, we're not normally thinking about the ultra complicated pregnancy or that high risk pregnancy. And the packages aren't really thinking about them either. So you will see things like those maximum clauses that say lost wages only up to this amount, or childcare, but only for non-routine or bed rest only provisions. Well, the question becomes, well, is a complicated pregnancy that requires twice as many appointments, is that routine or not routine? And some might say it's routine for a twin pregnancy, it's just not routine for a singleton. So you want things like that to be made more clear as to who's responsible for how long, and what happens if there is something that no one's expecting, who kind of runs the risk of where that financial liability will fall. The IPs generally don't want to take on like an unlimited amount of things. The surrogates aren't really expecting it. And that's where you will see these sort of financial caps come into play, saying, hey, you can get childcare for medical appointments, but only up to a maximum of $2,000 per, journey. Again, that may not be a problem for a singleton smooth pregnancy, but if it does get complicated, you can actually wipe through that pretty quickly, especially if you're in a high cost area where childcare for one or two or multiple children is pretty expensive per hour. And that's where, again, you really need to think of it as a surrogate. What is your situation like? Because again, these benefit packages are written for the general surrogate, for a, relatively smooth, uncomplicated pregnancy. If you have 3-4 kids who are younger and you run into a problem with this, that childcare provision is going to be more important to you than one of my surrogates who maybe has teenage children who are kind of able to and self-sufficient on their own. So you really want to look at, what does your benefit package say? What do you need uniquely to you as the surrogate? And ask for that ahead of time. Like, think about making that request to your agency before you get matched, because it's always harder to do that once we get into contract and people think we know what we're agreeing to. And then we start making a bunch of changes for things that, don't really work for you. We just want to make that known ahead of time so that protection is in place for you.
Wow, this was a jam-packed, great information podcast. Thank you so much for your time and your insights today. It's been very eye-opening. Thanks for listening to the Surrogates Corner with James Mahan. To learn more or get support from a firm that puts surrogates first, visit surrogatescorner.com. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share this episode with someone starting their journey. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.